Hello, everyone. Good evening. We will start tonight's event. I'm Mei Rado, Assistant Professor of Textiles and Dress History at Bard Graduate Center. Before introducing our speaker tonight, let's just make an announcement. With your registration, you can go to see our self-exhibition, which is open until 8 o'clock tonight, free of charge. So after the talk, if you feel like it, you can stop by our gallery just a few steps away. Tonight, it's really our pleasure to welcome Madame Esclarmonde Monteil. She's a curator in French Ministry of Culture. Her full title is Conservatrice en chef, fonction publique d'État. Her areas of specialization are decorative arts, textiles, and fashion. And she's responsible for the regions Grand Est and Centre-Val de Loire. She's a knight in the Ordre des Arts et Lettres in France. Prior to taking this job in 2022, Madame Monteil had served as the director of 3 museums in France. From 2018 to 2022, she was the director of Musée des Tissus in Lyon, the most important textiles museum and well known to many of us. From 2013 to 18, she's the director of Musée de la Toile de Jouy, specializing in printed textiles. And from 2003 to 2013, she was the director of Archaeology Museums of Oise. Madame Monteil has curated numerous textiles and fashion exhibitions, such as the one in Lyon she did to examine the role of Lyonnais textiles and then the couture house Yves Saint Laurent. At Museum of the Toile de Jouy, she did exhibitions on the Japanese painter Fujita and his little-known textiles and fashion creations. In addition to authoring many exhibition catalogs, she also contributed to numerous publications on textiles and fashion. Recent ones included Les Savoir-faire de la mode, published in 2023, and Les Textiles, published in 2020. And today, Madame Monteil will speak about her recent exhibitions, Made in France, Une histoire du textile, at the Archives nationales last year. This very well researched and well presented exhibition brought to light the rich collections of textile samples in the French National Archives. And today, we also have the fortune to see beautiful textiles brought by us by the private collector Joe Lasserson, based in New York. Here you can see the extraordinary collections of silks and printed textiles from the early 18th century to the early 19th century. Please.
Well, I wanted to start by thanking the whole staff at the Bard Graduate Center for having me tonight to present you this studies we made about the French textiles and especially the intervention of the French state in the textile industry from Louis XIV to nowadays. So it was already a challenge to do the exhibition because it's almost like 3 centuries of textiles, and tonight it's only 40 minutes. So I'll do my best. So this exhibition, we were 3 co-curators, so 2 archivists and I. And I want to dedicate it to the memory of Philippe Minard because we had a committee of scientists helping us for the exhibition, and he was the head of it. And he sadly passed away during the preparation of the exhibition. So we have a small video to make you regret that you didn't go to France and see the exhibition. It was held in the Marais in the Hôtel de Soubise, and we had many textiles, but we also borrowed some machines from the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers, the CNAM. So this was the exhibition. So at a time nowadays when the textile industry is at the heart of environmental and ethical awareness, revisiting its its history in France is a means of grasping the immense economic and social significance it once held in our country before its collapse at the end of the 20th century. The exhibition was based on the extensive sample collection in the F12 series of the National Archives, which is little known. So, if there are students that want to grasp this and start studying them, it's still there. And we present the actions of governments over 3 centuries. But basically, we had monarchy, we had republics, we had again monarchy and the empire, but all the regimes used the same three means for the textile industry, which was to control, to understand, and to encourage the industry. They had different ways of doing that, but the three pillars of it were the same. So this is what we found in the F12 series. We found almost 2,000 sheets like this with samples from the coarsest material, you see like these pieces, to the finest ones. And on the right side, you see what the inspectors of the factories would send to the central government. So they would write reports of everything that was produced in an area. So it all started under Louis XIV with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who was the son of a draper and a merchant in Reims. And he rose to the function of Contrôleur Général des Finances in 1665. And he dedicated his work to the development of the French textile factories by enacting regulation and setting up the factory inspectors, which were sort of the first civil servants, organized civil servants in France. And his economic policy is a form of mercantilism that has taken the name of Colbertism. So I put you the dates of the reign of Louis XIV, and the portrait you have here is actually in the Met. So I don't know if they display it all the time, but you can go and see him. So the first regulations were published in 1669, but even before that, he has started to try to revive the French textile industry because they realized that we were spending so much money in lace from the Netherlands, from Venice, and from silks from also Italy, and for woolens and worsted from also Flanders and England. So it was costing the kingdom a lot of money going away. So he decided that they have to develop economically France to diminish foreign trade. And so they thought that to improve the industry, you had to make better quality products. That's why they started by publishing those règlements, and the first ones were for the wool. And I don't know if canvas is the right word, but it was all the linen textiles. So the first two published regulations concerned the manufacture of woolen clothes and yarn and their dyeing. The purpose was to oblige manufacturers to deliver products of similar quality. And they have rules about raw materials, the number of yarn threads in chain and warp and weft, the processes, the dimension that must be respected. So the consumer is reassured. And until 1683, they passed 44 regulation and instruction that were published. So the inspectors had to know all the 44 regulations and to implement them. So if you just pass regulations and you have nobody to implement them, it's no use. So because they already had, the trades were organized in guilds, but they were not unified. And the purpose of Colbert was to have a unified system with the same regulation all over the country. So the Corps of Inspector was organized and professionalized over the decades. And at first, the inspectors were like the one for the wool and the ones for the linens. But after a while, it was reorganized according to geography. So they had regions and they would do all types of fabrics in every region. But yet they were poorly paid, and lots of them complained that they could not really do their work properly. So it was reorganized after a while. And so the candidates were first students, and then after a while they were sub-inspectors, and then they could become inspectors, and eventually the most brilliant of them could hope at the end of their career to become inspector general. So quality was first and foremost, and they would go and try to protect the end consumer and increase exportation and decrease importation. So we can see that the interest of those samples in the F12 series is also that the colors are pristine because they have been preserved between sheets of 18th century paper and never seen the light. So we can see what they were exporting for South America on the left and for Spain on the right. And you see the bright colors, and we can even see that the different shades that people preferred in the end market is different. We don't have the same shades for South America and for Spain. So the taste of the end consumer was also taken into consideration. So to control all that, all the inspectors went to the factories, to the tradesmen, to the weavers, to the dyers. So they had their books of regulations, and they would also go to the Bureau de Visite de Marque. So every important textile town had an office where the inspector would go, and all the textile makers would bring their finished pieces, and those would be inspected. And if they complied with the regulation, they would receive either a lead stamp like this, or a printed stamp like the ones on the far right. And you could not sell your pieces unless you had this stamp of approval. And the pieces that did not comply with the rules could be retained, even cut, and the makers could be fined. So, well, you don't have to read everything, but it's Voltaire writing a century after this and saying that there was never a better policy than the one that was instillated by Colbert. And for instance, he says, like, they brought lace workers from Venice and 200 from Flanders, and the government also gave money to encourage those people to settle in France. And they revived the tapestry of Aubusson, they revived the silk fabrics in Lyon, and they tried to poach the fabrication secrets from all over Europe, and especially England. So we always talk in the 18th century in France about manufactories and manufactories inspectors, but the word manufactories actually is three different things at that time. You can have, like, here is the map of the Gobelin, nowadays the Mobilier National in Paris. And this was state owned, it belonged to the crown, and it produced for the crown. Also, another type of manufactory on the right, on the top, is different private firms on the same geographical territory making the same product. So you have maybe 200 weavers in Normandy who started to make cretonne in Vimoutier and Lisieux. So it's the right on the top, and it's still a manufactory by 18th century terms. And then you have private firms like the one of Oberkampf in Juin-en-Josas, who are awarded by a patent the right to use the term royal manufactory. And Oberkampf was awarded the patent in 1783, and he ordered a new design by Jean-Baptiste Huet, the painter, to promote his print and to advertise the fact that he was then a royal manufactory. And we are very lucky to have a sample of this toile here. So later you can look at it, because in the toile, it is printed on this textile here. You can see Manufacture Royale de Oberkampf. And it was interesting to be a royal manufactory because you got sometimes financial help, but you could also get a production monopoly, exemption from custom duties on import and exports. zero-rate loans, title of nobility, free land. The workers were not taxed and could not be, what do you call them, drafted to go to war. You could keep your workers in times of war. And also you didn't have to house troops during war times. And the production tools could not be foreclosed as long as you had the patent. So it was a very privileged status, and lots of people wanted to have it. So they sent to the government, they sent applications saying, I'm building this new factory and I should be awarded a patent because so and so. So in 1755, the Dessoudet brothers established on the Drôme River, so south of Lyon, a factory like this that was powered by the water of the river, and it operated 12 mills with 2,800 spindles to make silk thread for the Lyon silk weavers. And they said, well, our company is state of the art, modern, you have to help us. But actually, the intendant of finance, who was Truden by the time, didn't grant them the royal factory status, and their factory failed after a few years. Another way to improve the French production and to promote French textiles was to poach foreign techniques. So mercantilist economic policies always have been accompanied by new means of collecting and appropriating techniques from all over Europe and beyond. And the attraction of foreign technicians and missions of experts outside the borders were the main tools used by Colbert. One such example was John Holker. He was a Jacobite and had to flee England. And he put himself in the service of France in 1747. But we sent him back to England in 1751 on a secret mission to buy machinery and to recruit specialized Catholic workers. And a year later, he was authorized to found its own velvet and calendaring factory in a suburb of Rouen, with a privilege of 15 years. And in 1755, he received the title of Inspecteur Général des Manufactures. And he was the one who brought back a foreign worker from England. And those are the first moires, I don't know how you sell it, moire, produced in France, because it was actually a British invention. And before John Holker, there was no moire in Lyon. And the text on the right is about the only female entrepreneur of the 18th century we know in the silk industry. She was by the name of Widow Palouis, Marie Gagnère, and she is one of the women inventors who gained visibility in the 18th century. She was from Lyon, and she promoted a technique of carding and spinning pierced silk cocoons, soie galette, which was a sort of using waste by recycling, and it was very profitable. But she entered into a competition with the silk weavers in Lyon, so she had to repatriate her industry in Paris, in Faubourg Saint-Denis, and she received the privilege. And she sent some samples to Marie Antoinette to say, look, it looks like real silk. Another such income of foreign technology, this time for the wools, was Jos van Robé, who was from Dutch origin. He was born in Kortrijk in 1630. And at Colbert's request, he founded in Abbeville in the north of France in 1665 an important manufacture of fine woolen sheets. And also he was granted the title of Royal Manufacturer with great privileges and considerable capital advances, exemption from tax and charges, and his workers too. He came with his machinery and his workers and settled in France. And at one point, he was employing 1,600 workers and even owned ships, vessels to ship his woolen clothes to Spain. We don't have a portrait of him. We have a portrait of one of his great-grandsons. And the factory in Abbeville is still there. The building is still visible in Abbeville. So he made a considerable fortune in France. And he taught us how to do very fine woolen clothes like the ones that were made in Holland. Another example, maybe you know of him, is John Kay, who invented the flying shuttle. And he thought he was not recognized for his own worth in England. And he knew that the French kingdom was giving money for people who were making progress in the textile industry. So he came to France in 1747 and introduced his flying shuttle to France. And the French government published, this is avis au public, so they published pamphlets to advocate for the flying shuttles because some of the weavers were not very eager to adopt it. But he received a pension, and he was, until the end of his life, he was pensioned by the French government for bringing the shuttle. So another way to promote the textile industry was for the state and court influence, either by using some patterns and some fabrics in the French palaces. They would start a fashion, but they also were ordering directly from the manufacturer in Lyon or from Oberkampf. I don't know if you have seen, but they reupholstered the small apartments of Marie Antoinette, of the Queen, in Versailles with printed cottons. So the court had a really big influence on the textile industry in France at the time. Lyon is a different story, the silk industry in Lyon. It was very well organized, the Grande Fabrique, before Colbert arrived. So the influence of Colbert was less in Lyon. They tried to improve the technology by sending Vaucanson, who was the inventor of automatons, to improve the weaving loom in Lyon in 1741. So from May to October 1742, Jacques Vaucanson was accompanied by a Lyon silk specialist, Mr. Monteil, and inspected the manufactories in France, in Lyon, but also in Italy, and started to devise a new weaving loom and tried to improve all the machines used, but the Lyonnais refused to change their ways, and Vaucanson had to leave Lyon. So we have a few examples of Gilles's collection of the Lyon textiles of the 18th century. They were anyway improvements, such as made by Jean Revel, or like the point Berkeley, which is an invention you can see in one of the textiles. Before, you used to have woven bits, like you had one color and it was one solid piece of color. With this new invention, you could mingle different colors, and it would give you shading and more depth and better designs. So that was an improvement made in Lyon. The fashion in Paris, especially in the court, would be a disaster sometimes. Like if you had in the French court or European courts, you had a few passing of important people, suddenly all the courts would wear black, and it would be a disaster for the Lyon industry. So, or if the fashion changed and the Lyonnese weavers had not adapted, they would not sell for a while. So by the 18th century, the Lyon silk weaver would send their designers to Paris to follow the fashion already. We come to the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is a radical turning point for the textile sector. The affirmation of liberalism was growing by the end of the 18th century, even before the French Revolution. And we can see that Roland de la Platière, who was a writer for the Encyclopédie, but who was also an inspector of the manufacture, of the textile manufacture, said already by 1784, he said, "I have read all the regulation. I think we must delete them all. I have seen nothing better than freedom." And the French Revolution took the word of that. And in 1791, they passed different laws, the Goudard law and the Loi d'Allard, Pierre d'Allarn, which they really removed all the corporations, and they suppressed the inspectors. And basically, the Constituent Assembly wanted to replace corporatism by something else, but then it stopped, and it never got to the point to pass a new law. So they wiped the state, but did not build something else. And it was not well received by the textile industry because they had no rules and they didn't know what to do anymore. So everybody could start a textile factory, everybody could produce anything, and nobody knew what the good quality was anymore. So when the consulate and the First Empire came to be, they realized that they knew nothing anymore about the French textile industry because there were no more inspectors. So first, for cottons, they started a survey called the Champagny Survey of the situation of the French cotton industry in 1805 and 1806. And they asked the prefect, because France had been divided into départements. And so it was the administration that went to see the manufactories and asked them, what do you produce? But the prefect of the department of Aube writes to the central government, it doesn't work because every time we deal with this kind of work, we regret the suppression of the inspectors and the police regime they represented. Without them, we can only get false reports, given that suspicious merchants always give false reasons for this research and fear to see them turn against them. So the picture the government got of the French textile industry was blurred, and it was not very easy for the government to help them. And it got worse because of the continental blockade, because the raw materials could not reach France anymore, especially cotton and dyes that came from the rest of the world. They imagined another way to promote French textiles and French quality, and in 1798, the Minister of the Interior, François de Neufchâteau, imagined gathering manufacturers in Paris to present their products. So the first exhibition took place for 3 days on the Champ de Mars, and it had been assembled in a hurry, so there were only 110 exhibitors that came mostly from Paris and its surroundings. And they were awarding awards and writing reports, and there were 3 types of merits: the fruits of invention, the results of improvement, and the monuments of public utility. So you see in this one, it's casimir. So I don't know if there is a word for that type of textile, but it's this ribbed kind of textile. And they got prizes for their work in the exhibition of 1806. And as soon as people start receiving medals for their products, they put it on the paper, and it sort of replaces the lead stamps of the former manufacturers. They use it for advertisement purpose and to prove the quality of their products. And this will go on throughout the 19th century. And of course, once again, the government resorted to ordering silks from Lyon to revive the industry. So the imperial orders were vital to relaunch the Lyon factories, because they had drastically fallen under the revolution, because silk was associated with the former regime. It was a high-class textile. So the cottons kept on selling really well during the French Revolution, but the silks didn't. And Napoleon ordered so much silk that the looms, there were only 8,000 looms working in 1802 in Lyon, and it grew to 13,000 looms, more than 30,000 looms in 1810. And the orders of the Garde-Meuble Impérial were so huge from 1806 to 1813 that they ordered something like 50 miles of fabric. And the Mobilier National still has pristine samples. They were used throughout the 19th century, and we still have pieces that have never been used. And another problem was the French the continental blockade. So they tried to plant cotton in the north of Italy, which was French at the time. And they also tried to use natural plants for dyeing. And this is a gentleman from the east of France sending letters to the government saying, I found plants that have the proper local plants that can produce fast dyes. And we really can see that they were not fast. They all sort of brownish or greenish. It didn't really work that well. And another way to promote the textile industry was the patent. So by 1781, they started to patent innovation. So people would have a privilege and nobody else could use their invention for many years. So the beautiful vignette of the patent, the print that you received was designed by Prudhon. I wish now our forms or legal forms were designed by artists. It's no longer the case. And people were sending samples of their inventions to receive a patent. So this is, for instance, a printing in gold and silver on textile invented by Mr. Romont, but we do not know whether this was successful, whether it was used or not. So the next step of the work with those samples in the F12 series would be to compare them to other remaining textiles to see whether or not all the invention have been used. So by the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution and the Commercial Revolution had taken place. So we materialized that in the exhibition by turning to metal beams instead of wooden ones. And with the fall of the empire, the public authorities paid attention to working conditions and in particular to the exploitation of youth labor. And regarding foreign trade, the period is marked by the missions of economic intelligence, or more prosaically, of intelligence against the background of colonial expansion. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the development of the textile industry led to the grouping of production in large factories equipped with machines, either worked with water power or steam. And very young employees from 6-year-old onwards were common, and they earned only the quarter of the salary of an adult. In Alsace, in 1844, children under the age of 16 represented about 30% of the textile workforce. And so the government decided that it had to tackle the subject, and it sent a doctor, Dr. Villarmé, to visit the departments where the cotton, wool, and silk industries occupied the most workers. So he visited the Mulhouse region in Alsace, but also Lille, Roubaix, Tourcoing in the north, Nîmes, Carcassonne in the south, and the region of Lyon and Saint-Étienne in the spring of 1836. Then there was much debate at the chamber, and they eventually, in 1841, on March 22nd, they passed the first labor law, and it was for the labor of children employed in the textile manufactures and workshops. So it was the first ever labor regulation in France, breaking with the principle of non-intervention by the state in the relationship between employers and employees. And this law prohibited the labor of children under 8 years of age. And for the others, between 8 to 12, they could work maximum 12 hours a day. And night work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. was prohibited for children under 13 years of age. Yes. And it's only moved to 14 years of age in 1936. So those were illustration of the book. The title of the book by Hector Malot, it's called Nobody's Girl. It has been translated to English. And it shows young women working in the factory, and one of them, her hand gets caught in one of the machines and she gets hurt. So by the middle of the 19th century, the intervention of state was to protect in some way the workforce more than controlling the end product. There were also progress, if you may call it so, in chemistry. By 1856, William Henry Perkins discovered Mauveine, the first synthetic industrial dye. In 1869, it was madder that was synthesized, and around about the 1900s, about 700 synthetic dyes were available on the market, but nobody studied the effect they had on the health, neither of the workers or the people who wore the textile, until the Punch in 1862 published this cartoon, The Arsenic Waltz. It was at that time the fashion was for green, and the famous Shield green and Paris green were made with arsenic. About 20% of the textiles at that time contained high doses of substances like arsenic or lead that were really bad for your health. And a sample of green stained muslin may contain more than 4 grams of Shield green arsenic by square meter of material. And you have to remember that it was the time of the crinoline, so you had extensive amounts of textile around you. And the first to suffer from these arsenic and heavy metals were the workers in the factories. But until the people who wore them became sick, the state took no law, no passed any law to stop that. It was also the regime, the end of the regime of protectionism. It lasted until the French Second Empire, but the future Napoleon III decided to pass a treaty in 1860 with England. It was like a new commercial coup, and the French textile industry lobbied against this free trade agreement with England, but Napoleon III decided it would go anyway. And it lasted only until 1892 because it was a disaster for the French textile industry. We were not up to date with the mechanization that had happened in England, for instance, and we could not fight. And to implement the new taxes, the people at the customs need to have sample books like this, because what was lace and what was guipure, it's like a coarse, it's not really lace, it's thicker than lace, and one was taxed heavily and the other was not. So you if you could pass your lace for guipure, you would pay less taxes. So they have in the French archives booklets like this for the customs officer to see what has to be taxed at what price. And of course, it was the time of exploring the whole world for new markets or new raw products. So, in addition to world exhibition, the administration also financed commercial missions abroad to collect new raw materials that could be used by textile manufacturers, and at the same time to look for new opportunities to sell French products. The best example is the Chinese mission of Théodose de la Grenée between 1843 and 46. And in this mission, they had 5 people for textile. Isidore Head, who was from Saint-Étienne, was the representative for silk textiles. Nathalie Rondeau was mission for the wool textiles of the northern France. Auguste Haussmann was mission for cottons, while Edmond Renard was in charge of the article of Paris, which was like fashionable items produced in the textile industry in Paris. So they went all the way to China, but on the way they stopped in Batavia and they collected samples of what was selling there, not produced there, but what was selling in the market of Batavia, to see what they could send or ask the French factories to produce to be sold in those markets. And when they returned, they had exhibition touring France of what they had sampled during the mission. So the exhibition took place in Paris, in Lyon, and in Saint-Étienne. And there were other missions like this. And in the National Archives, you also have letters from people saying, well, I'm going to travel in South America. If you give me a small stipend, I can also study what is selling there and give you information, for instance. So there were missions like this one where completely paid by the states, but otherwise sometimes individuals could also help the textile industry. And the worldwide competition was fierce. So you had to know what was happening in the other markets. So the Ministry of Commerce regularly collected foreign samples and sent them to the chambers of commerce and institutions for examination. And for instance, the Fibria, which is the one in the middle, it was a book published by Stephen Merrill Allen in Boston in 1861. The title in English was Fibria, a practical and economical substitute for cotton, embracing a full description of the process of cottonizing flax, hemp, jute, china grass, and other fiber, so that the same may be spun or woven upon either cotton or woolen machinery. And the same year it was published in America, it was translated in French, and they procured some of the fibers to make a try, but the Schlumberger factory in France concluded that this material could not be spun with the machine in use in France at the time. They also studied what was shown on the foreign fairs, like in Weimar in Germany, and brought back samples of wools from there. And they also tried to exploit whatever was available in the French colony, such as a different type of madder produced in Tunisia. So it was like trying to find all the resources in the world, either to improve your own industry or to see what you could sell abroad. And of course, there were the universal exhibition that replaced the exhibition of the products of the industry. So the first ones were only French, and those became universal exhibitions. And in 1867, Frédéric Leplay developed a new innovative classification system organizing objects by nature and nationality. So textile exhibitors were usually installed on the Champ de Mars, but some of them had private pavilion at the fairs. And in the Palace for Textiles, visitors could discover various aspects of the textile industry, such as the history of yarn, raw fabrics, finished fabrics, tools and machines used in manufactories. And they were using museographic techniques such as wall hanging, showcases, and tables to highlight their products. So for fabrics exhibition, it was very important. And here you can see that the same Nathalie Rondeau, who was on the Chinese mission, was also responsible for organizing in 1867 the pavilion of silk producers in the exhibition. Because at that time, the silk producers in France were losing markets to the Americans and to the British, and they had to make a really big show at the exhibition to compensate for that. They were also soon coming. By 1900, the artificial silk was looming. So it was another concurrent because you were allowed at that time to call rayon silk. So the relative share of French exhibitors decreased from 14% in the 1867 fair to only a mere 5% in 1900. So you can see the rise of the foreign competition. And of course, we are moving towards globalization in the 20th century. So, as we have seen, the replacement of mercantilism by free trade was gradual. But between the period of the Napoleonic Wars and the neo-Colbertist policy that was in France in the main part of the 19th century, the triumph of free trade was really late to come to France. But it was during this mercantilist period that the foundations of the globalization of textiles that we know today were laid. The first truly global fiber, of course, being cotton, and it is still here today. But then came to Europe, and especially to France, the two armed conflicts of the First and the Second World War, which had a really big impact on textile industry. And during the two world wars, the state resumed a dirigist control over the textile industry, but it also had to face an increasing globalization. So during World War I, as soon as July 31st, 1914, the government demanded that all the textile industry would concentrate on the production for the army, not only uniforms, but other goods, bandages, plane wings, all the textiles were reserved for the armed force. And with the occupation of the north of France, many factories had to move south because most of the French textile industry was in the occupied zone and under the bombs. So the challenge was to find raw materials, because just before the war, France imported 70% of its wool from Australia and New Zealand already, and it also imported 80% of its cotton from the United States. And the textile for civilians became really scarce during the First World War. And factories in Vienne, in the south of Lyon, proposed to create what is called in England a shoddy from reclaimed wool and cotton. And they called it the national cloth, the drap national. And it would have 25% of cotton waste, 50% of what they call Renaissance wool, so it's reclaimed wool, and only 25% of new wool. And the price would be really cheap. It would be only 8 francs a meter, but it never worked. It was not produced in enough quantities, and it was not good quality, and people didn't want to buy it. And it was also the beginning of artificial fibers. The first one being invented by the Frenchman Hilaire Bernigaud de Chardonnay, patented in 1885, but it was based on cellulose nitrate, so it was highly flammable, and it was known as mother-in-law silk in the journals at the time, because you could put your mother-in-law on fire, basically. So we are lucky to have, it's a very small sample, you see it on the table, but it's the only sample I know of this first rayon silk made in his factory in Besançon, north of Lyon. And the process was too unstable to last, so later the viscose process that we still have replaced this one as artificial silk. And there was a third process, the Bamberg silk, made, or cupro, made with copper. And this is kept in the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers. It's all the chemicals you need to make this Bamberg silk. And all of them, those new artificial fibers, used the name of silk and were competitors of the Lyon silk industry. So some of them invested in artificial silks, the Lyon people. So at first they were reserved for quality garments because they were novelty, but the new man-made textiles became gradually cheaper and spread and were for poor people, and silk was reserved for high quality. Nylon was invented in 1935 here at Dupont de Nemours, and it spread in the following of the Second World War to France. It spread so much that you had nylon stockings sold in machines in the French subway in Paris. So in America, you only have man-made fibers. In France, we differentiate between artificial fibers obtained by using natural raw products, and synthetic fibers obtained by spinning substances created by chemical synthesis of petroleum, like nylon. So the counter-offensive on natural fibers was launched. So they paid for studies about artificial textiles, and they tried to lobby. And by 1934, they obtained a decree from the government prohibiting the abusive use of the word silk in the name artificial silk. And then they had to use viscose or rayon for those fabrics. And then in 1963, the government passed a decree on the labeling of raw materials in the composition of textile produce, because the consumer was completely lost. So here again we have a change of the government. It's not focusing on the end product. It's not focusing on the worker. Now it's focusing on the consumer, and it's trying to inform and protect the end consumer. And there was a division of artificial fibers in the French Ministry for Industry to study those new things. But they also kept on trying to research new materials that they could use that were locally produced. And during the war and after the war, they tried to use the genêt, which had been used in the 18th century, but was no longer used for textile. And they tried to revive that, and the government financed all these trials, but it was not a great success either. Faced with the rise of the new textiles, the government is financing study missions also and surveys to study the reception of these innovations by consumers. And so they ask people, what do you think about fibran? So fibran is like the short fibers spun together, not a continuous fiber like rayon, but and people answer to the best of our abilities, but they still don't understand what the difference is with the traditional textiles. So until the mid 1950s, textiles were almost entirely composed of natural fibers, and the new washing machines were generally used to wash either white or colored cotton and linen textile. So two washing programs were only necessary, one for boiling and one for uncolored or colored things. But by the early 60s, chemical fibers are developed on a large scale, and verbal information about the care of your fabrics was no longer sufficient. And so the government was involved in the use of symbols to inform the consumer on how to care for their fabrics. So the first attempt was made by the industrialists themselves. They worked together and they started to make these fleza stamps. So if you had the fish, you could wash it. If you had the cat, you could not put it into water. And you had the elephant, you could boil it. It was resisting almost everything. It was so sturdy, it could resist anything. So this small dress, the blue dress that we have here, if on the small table, you can see it later. It has the fish label, so you can wash it. And in the publication of the 1960s, they advertise, they show the growth of the textile industry worldwide. But you can see that it is still in 56 the natural materials that make the bulk of the textile the people have. And every single person would consume about 6 kilos of fabric in France at that time a year. Nowadays, we are between 15 and 20 kilos every year, and most of it is synthetic fibers. But of course, we couldn't close the whole world with natural fibers. It would be impossible. So on March 26, 1963, following several international symposia on labeling for the maintenance of textiles in the late 50s, an international organization for the labeling of textile products, the Ginetex, was founded in Paris, and maintenance symbols have become registered trademarks in most countries nowadays. And since the 1870s, the European Union has imposed a labeling of composition. It must be fixed on the products, it must be readable and written in the country's language, and it will give the percentage of the different textile fibers composing the garment, or even the different part if there are different composition in the one garment. But it's the only mandatory thing for a textile in France. The origin, like made in France, made in England, made in China, is not mandatory. It's up to the producer to put it or not. And if you want to put made in France, the last significant operation has to be operated in France. So if you have like a garment that is supposed to button, you import it wholly made, but you don't have the buttons on, and you put the buttons in France, it can be labeled made in France because you cannot use it without the buttons. But already by the end of the Second World War, the French textile industry was lagging behind. So in 1943, the government created a tax to encourage textile production and to renovate the production factories to modernize them. And the control committee of the Textile Production Incentive Fund was created in 1948. And it examined the application for subsidies attributable to the special account created. And the members could carry out verification. So again, control and help for the textile industry. And the National Archive kept many files of the application for aid by textile companies until the 1960s. One such company was the company Le Peignage Amédée Prouveau and Company, which was founded in Roubaix in the north of France in 1851 by Amédée Prouveau and 3 other brothers. And they had a textile factory, a wool combing factory. They had all the chain covered. But they started to grow abroad and they started to delocalize their factories by the 60s. So the French industry is always complaining, but they also started to produce abroad. So they were the one who started delocalizing the production. And that led to the textile crisis of the 70s. So the Interprofessional Committee for the Renovation of Textile Industries was set up in 66, again to grant aids and subsidies to stakeholders in the sector until 1982. By then, by the seventh plan, because we still had a planned economy by then, the state decided that the textile industry was something that was no longer promising for the future, and it was better to invest the state funds in computers, planes, whatever, but not the textile. So after 1982, the subsidies for the textile industry in France really were not there anymore. And you see that the last one in 1993, it's not a workers' demonstration. It's a patron, it's the factory's owner protesting against the textile made abroad, made in ailleurs. The Commissariat Général au Plan, planning the state intervention in the economy, devised a new set of measures in 1981, and they said, well, it's not worth it 2 years after. And the textile industry still employed 764,000 workers in 1970 in France, only 300,000 in 1990, and nowadays it's only 62,000. So you see, like in 20 years, it almost completely disappeared, except for niche textiles such as silks in Lyon or technical textiles, also in Lyon. But most of it has disappeared, and now it's the French luxury fashion that is known, but the textiles are not made in France. And then by the 90s, the intervention of state concentrated on helping the different textile schools. You wonder why they were helping the schools since the factories were all disappearing. But most of them had been founded in the 19th century. So you have some of them in the north of France, some of them in Alsace. The NC team, this one, would have been one of the oldest schools in France. It would have celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2011, but in 2006, it became engineers' school. So all of them now are engineering schools, but no longer textile schools. And we will close this presentation by a small movie. It's a song and a movie made in the factory Rodiaceta. It was the factory in Lyon and Besançon which purchased the patent for making nylon in France from Dupont de Nemours. And the one in Besançon, the one you will see in the film, had absorbed the first artificial silk factory of Chardonnay.
Merci, Rhône Poulenc, trust de la chimie. T'as baptisé nos usines avec des noms de fusées, des noms de vins capiteux. Lyon-Vesse, gorge de loup, belle étoile Saint-Fond, péage de Roussillon. derrière les hauts murs.
So the Rhodiaceta, the name comes from the Latin Rhodanus, and it was first Rhodiaceta with an S, like silk, in 1922. But by 1934, it had to come Rhodiaceta with a C for acetate, because it was no longer allowed to use the silk. And it was a company that ceased operation in 1981. It had two huge factories, one in Vèze, north of Lyon, and one in Besançon. And the factories were several hectares. I mean, they were really huge, and thousands of, like 8,000 workers were employed at the heydays of the factories. And now you cannot even see the trace of them in the landscape in Lyon. They have completely disappeared, and new buildings have been built over them. So, and at that time, it was the workers themselves that were formed by people from the movie industry, and they were the ones who were filming in their factory and who were writing the song, which was sung by a famous French singer at the time. So this was the last of the big textile industry in France. So where are we now? The state is trying to regain a hand, not on the textile industry, but on fashion. And the French government has invented the éco-balise, which is a system for the consumer to know the ecological impact of the garments. So by October 2025, all the garments sold in France should have an éco-balise so that the consumer knows the impact, and basically it's supposed to be curbing the fast fashion system in France. So once again, the state is trying to intervene, but I'm not sure it will revive the textile industry. We have some hope. For instance, the linen industry. We produce in France, we grow a lot of the linen and flax that is used throughout the world, but the whole of it was going to China to be spun. And now we have two factories that came back to France and that are starting again to produce linen thread in France, but it's minimal. So that's 3 years of state intervention in the French textile industry.
We have time for questions, and I see a question right here.
Hi, is it on? I have two questions. One, you talked about mills in Lyon, but didn't mention the family workshops in Croix-Rousse and how regulations may have affected them, because I heard from workshops there that the regulations were used to oppress the families and reject the perfectly good linens because they weren't completely up. And the second question, you didn't mention the Huguenots and leaving France for Lancashire and Paterson, New Jersey, and what happened with that process.
Okay, so the regulation, it was always a fight, and the weavers or the manufacturers were always between two minds, because in one way they liked the regulation because they knew what the competition was, but in another way they said it curbed them. They could not invent, they could not produce whatever they want. And of course the workers were of another mind. I mean, it was in Lyon, you had two different populations. You had the people who had the money, who owned the weaving looms, and then you had the poor workers that were weaving. And of course, they were antagonists, and sometimes the regulation protected more the merchants, the wealthy ones, than the workers. That's why we had in Lyon many upheavals of the weavers who were paid very low wages to produce the beautiful textiles. Now I've lost the second question. The Huguenot. The Huguenot it's a difficult story. The French Protestants, of course, left France, and not only it was a blow to the textile industry, but to all kind of trades, because they were highly skilled people. But as you have seen, foreign people like Oberkampf, he was not a Catholic, and he was allowed to settle in France, and bring his workers over from the south of Germany, from Switzerland. And it's the same with Olker. He was allowed to bring workers from England, and the Dutchman Van Robbe also brought people that were Protestants, and they were allowed to practice their religion because we needed the the knowledge. So it was, they could continue being not Catholics and still be French and receive. Oberkampf was received his letters of naturalization, and he was a Protestant to the end of his life. The only thing he couldn't do was marry in a French church, so he married at the embassy of Sweden.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
So I was just wondering if you've heard about the Fond Romani. It's an atelier formed by two young ladies. Charlotte is their first name, Charlotte Fond and Charlotte Romani. So they're operating in Paris, and they went to school for 4 years to learn the old craft of the savonnerie. And they're reviving this old technique, which requires about 540 hours just to complete 1 square meter, the densest, most incredible carpets. So I was wondering if you know about the government supporting such initiatives to keep it going.
Okay, so all techniques like well, the carpets or the weaving of tapestries or lace making are subsidized a little bit by the French government. Needle lace, for instance, only relies on French, the few ladies that can still do needle lace are paid by the French government, and all their production goes to French public buildings, the Élysée and all that. For tapestry and carpet weaving, it's been revived in Aubusson, and there are now schools, or even in the Mobilier National, young people can learn the trade. And the Aubusson Museum, the Tapestry Museum, did a really good work of promoting tapestry again. And now there used to be only 4 atelier workshop left in Aubusson, and they're back to about 15 nowadays. And now the Mobilier National has been merged with the Sèvres Manufactory and Museum. And so it's called National Manufactories. So there is the carpet manufactory, the tapestry manufactory, and the porcelain manufactory. And they're having lots of exhibitions to promote those crafts and help young people who are trying to revive them. So right now in Paris, there is an exhibition called Les Nouveaux Ensembliers, who shows people doing passementerie, doing carpet weaving, and things like that. And this exhibition will travel to try and promote those crafts.
So my question is in regards to globalization versus producing your own unique arts. Would one say then that since the French, for instance, are no longer manufacturing and making lace, is it a loss because of globalization? Or is, in a perfect world, would we want to go back to just being French produced? Because I know in this country we've lost our textile industry. It's gone for the most part. I don't know what the answer is. I'm just curious.
No, well, the problem that we have is plastic, basically, and the problem is that until maybe World War II, everybody knew their textiles. The common knowledge about textiles and how to maintain them and how they were made was a general knowledge. Everybody knew. Nowadays, people cannot tell the difference between like a beautiful silk like this or a beautiful printed cotton like this and what it takes to make them, and something made out of plastic. So basically, my opinion is if we want to solve the problem, we have to teach the younger generation the value of textile, what it takes to make a textile, how long it is to go from the fiber to the finished garment. And then people can start also to appreciate things that take longer to make. when I was working in the Toile de Jouy Museum, we had the visit of Maria Grazia Chiori, who was the head of Dior at that time, and we showed her prints like this. And she said, it's not the price that will be a problem. It's that the consumer wants the thing now. Even in haute couture, people who have the money are willing to pay a price, but they want it now. And it's not possible when you have things like that.
Choose one and give an example as to how much a week would take to weave so much.
Okay. So if you take one of the silks, a weaver would weave a few centimeters every day. But it doesn't take into account the time you have to sort of program the loom. Because a loom is basically the ancestor of a computer. If you wanted to weave a design, you have to set it. And before the invention of the pierced card by Mr. Jacquard, you would have those thread looms. So you had to attach every cord to another one, and you have someone to pull the right ones at the right time. So setting up a loom and changing the pattern that you were weaving into a loom would already take weeks. And then you were weaving very slowly at a time. And for printed cottons, it's the same. You would receive the white cloth, usually from India at that time. And then you had to bleach it, whiten it, calendar it, because the cotton would be fuzzy. And if you were printing on fuzzy cotton, the pattern would fuse around, so it would not be nice. Then you would print your first mordant, not the color directly, the mordant. Then you would put it in the dye bath, and you would get maybe all the pink to dark reds in one bath of madder. Then you had to bleach it again, because the white bottom background would be sort of pinkish and you wanted it white. Then you would start again with another color. And in the end, you would have women with little pencils penciling in the blue, if there was not too much blue. So it would be months in the making.
Hi, thank you so much for your very thorough and fascinating lecture. I was interested in the Colbert's quality control, and I'm personally interested in the different trends for different white fabric before and after, like Napoleon. So I was just wondering how quality control for color was done, if it can't be quantified, if the fabrics are not color fast, like how was that kept standardized?
Okay, so what the inspectors did, they would cut pieces of the finished fabrics, and they would make what they call the débouillis, which is boiled up proofing. So they would boil the textile and see whether it shrank and whether the color was steadfast or not. So you can boil it with soap or without soap, with lye? Yeah. And you see how the color would resist. And if somebody had printed on his textile bon teint, steadfast color, and the débouillis shown that the color was not steadfast, they would be fined.
Maybe you had a question.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Lyonnais silk industry today, the niche market for high-end silk, because it's not under the government support like the national manufacturing, and how the education is carried on, and what is the state of the silk industry today?
Okay, nowadays in Lyon, the silk industry is basically a furnishing silk industry, because the last niche of the people, so basically you have Presles, you have Tassinari et Châtel, and that's basically about it. And they are the heirs of those people in the 18th century, so they still have all the archive and all the pattern design, so they can reproduce them. But there are very few looms still in activity. And for them, the war between Ukraine and Russia was quite a blow, because Russia was a very important market for high-end silks. The curtains in the White House were also manufactured in France, the silk curtains in the White House here. So maybe the new ballroom will have silk curtains from Lyon. I don't know. We hope so. But it's very... Oh, wait, they do gold. They do gold. Yeah. And also in Lyon, we still have this gold thread factory. So, you have a silk thread and it has a very thin layer of gold wrapped around it. And it's the factory named Carlion, which still makes it in Lyon. And all the armies in the world, all the pilots of all the aircrafts in the world, they're galons, when you come in, they're emblems. Yes, all of that is golden thread made in Lyon. But the haute couture industry, it's very rare that they use silks made in Lyon. So the Chanel and Hermès both realized that they were losing their producers. So they invested so differently. Hermès bought the factories, and Chanel is just investing in existing factories so that they can ensure the production, for instance, of the silk for the doubling silks for the haute couture. It's made not in Lyon, but next to Saint-Étienne. They also invested in a moulinage, I don't know how you call it, for making silk threads. So they invested in that too. And Hermès has a factory in Pierre-Bénite, south of Lyon, where they produce their own silk for their own use. But it's very small.
So I have to bring us to a close, but I do hope that you will all take advantage of the opportunity to see these exquisite pieces in the front and also to visit the gallery before it closes at 8 p.m. But for now, please join me in thanking Esclarmonde Monteil.